The hallway was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brings calm. It was the kind that presses against your chest, makes you second-guess your footsteps, and turns every closed door into a question mark. Vanessa Rhodes adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, exhaled once, and stepped toward conference room 7C, one where StratusInc was about to announce the finalization of a $2.1 billion global tech merger. The deal she had spent 14 months stitching together, one red-eye flight, one translation, one crisis at a time. Every clause, every legal workaround, every cultural nuances, he had held them like glass in her hands, careful not to let a single one slip. But before she could reach the handle, a security officer stepped in front of her. Tall, expressionless, corporate badge glinting in the fluorescent light. "Miss Rhodes," he said, voice flat, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." I-9. She blinked. "Excuse me?" He didn't flinch. "You're no longer needed in that room." The sentence didn't compute. It echoed, but didn't land. Not at first. No explanation. No emotion. Just erased. Behind the door, she heard muffled voices, familiar ones. Laughs. Applause. The sound of champagne bottles being opened. Her name wasn't being called. Her seat wasn't being saved. A junior analyst squeezed past her with a nod, carrying a stack of pitch decks. One of them bore the cover Vanessa had designed, but now, in place of her initials, were the words, Lead, M. Cohen. Mara Cohen, her former intern. Vanessa didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't push the door open. She simply looked down at her phone, refreshed her calendar, and saw it. A meeting had been quietly removed. Her title had been reassigned, her salary reduced, her access revoked. And no one told her. No warning, no handshake, no farewell. Just one sentence at the door. "You're no longer needed in that room." But what they didn't know, what no one saw, was that Vanessa had written something into the bones of that deal that would make the silence temporary, painful for them, powerful for her. And this wasn't the end. This was the pause before everything shattered. My name is Vanessa Rhodes. I'm 36 years old, and until last Thursday, I was the Senior Director of Strategic Mergers at StratusInc Technologies. But titles never meant much to me. Not really. What mattered was the work. 14 months ago, when StratusInc first hinted at a merger with Kinetra fast-rising AI analytics firm in Solno, one wanted to touch it. The legal risks, the time zone logistics, the compliance nightmares. It was considered too complex, too volatile, too career-ending, if it went sideways. And maybe that's why I took it. Not out of pride. Not to prove anything. But because I knew I could hold it. You see, I wasn't the kind of executive who showed up just to delegate and take credit. I was the one still answering emails at 2 a.m. The one who carried a portable Wi-Fi hotspot to review redlined clauses on a layover in Abu Dhabi. The one who stayed on Zoom calls while attached to an IV drip after collapsing from exhaustion in a hotel lobby in Singapore. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because when I give my word, I mean it. And when I believe in a deal, I don't let go. Every integration meeting, every vendor contract, every whispered doubt from legal, I documented, translated, streamlined. I held people together who didn't speak the same language, sometimes literally. There were nights I juggled 3 time zones, 4 negotiation tables, and a dozen personalities all on edge. And still, I made it work. I wasn't just managing a merger. I was building a bridge between 2 companies, 2 cultures, 2 continents. My fingerprints were on every inch of it. And not because I needed power, but because I knew what could happen if even one piece cracked. Mara Cohen, me, former intern, didn't know those cracks. She hadn't been on the ground in Seoul when the Kinetra board nearly walked out over a mistranslation buried in Section 4B. She hadn't smoothed over a vendor's panic attack mid-meeting in Jakarta. She hadn't stood on a sidewalk in the rain at midnight, talking a CFO down from blowing up the entire agreement over a single sentence. But I had. I didn't just write the deal. I lived inside it. So, when they stripped my name off the documents, when they reassigned my office, when they acted like I could be replaced with a fresher face and a polished PowerPoint, they weren't just removing a person. They were severing the only thread holding the merger together. The truth is, I was never just part of the team. I was the team. But they didn't see it. Or maybe they did. And that's why they tried to erase me quietly. No confrontation. No noise. Just a calendar update. A missing badge. A new name in the header. They thought I'd disappear. They thought I'd go quietly. But what they forgot is that I wasn't holding that deal together for applause or ego or loyalty. I was holding it because I knew what no one else did. That without me, the deal wouldn't survive. And neither would they. Vanessa didn't notice the name at first. She was standing by the communal printer, waiting for a document she hadn't been told to print, just curious. Her access to internal systems had been slowly disappearing one login failure at a time. But for some reason, that morning, the printer still worked. A stack of pitch decks rolled out. Clean. Branded. And on the top page, her eyes caught the title. Strategic Integration Plan. Kinetra x Stratasync. Lead. M. Cohen. Vanessa froze. M. Cohen. There weren't many Cohens at Stratasync. Just one, in fact. Mara. Her intern. 2 summers ago, Mara had arrived bright-eyed, fresh out of a top-tier MBA program, and completely unfamiliar with the pacing of real-world negotiations. Vanessa had taken her under her wing not because she had to, but because someone once did that for her. She had taught Mara how to read silence in a boardroom, how to spot a clause written to trap, how to lead without dominating. And now, Mara's name was on Vanessa's deal. Not in the footnotes. Not as support. As lead. Vanessa turned the page. The content was hers. The models, the language, the timelines, they were repackaged, polished, but unmistakably her. The projections she stayed up at night refining. The risk assessments she'd triple-checked in a hotel bathroom in Tokyo. Even the branding color palette, Vanessa's own signature shades, was still being used. But her name? Gone. A lump formed in her throat, not from shock, but from a deeper kind of betrayal. One that wore a familiar smile and said, "Thank you for mentoring me," before sliding into the chair you built. Later that day, she passed by conference room 4A. Through the half-closed blinds, she saw them, Elliot, the VP of Corporate Strategy, and Mara, sitting at the head of the table. Mara was presenting. Confident. Eager. Her voice carried even through the glass. Vanessa had been in that seat more times than she could count. But now, she stood outside, unseen, unneeded. What stung more than the erasure was the synchronization. The way Elliot nodded along to Mara's every word. The way he smiled at her like this had been the plan all along. Because maybe it had. Maybe all those late-night calls Vanessa answered, all those deliverables she turned in early, the sacrifices she made weren't loyalty points, just fuel. Fuel for someone else's climb. There was no email informing her of the change. No handover, no meeting. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for consent, only surrender. And perhaps worst of all, Mara didn't even look uncomfortable. Not a flicker of guilt. Not a pause before speaking. She had learned well. Too well. Vanessa watched as Mara clicked to the final slide, a slide Vanessa had designed herself months ago, and said, "We're confident this plan will secure full alignment by Q3. We. Not her. Not Vanessa." And with that, the door shut. Literally. Metaphorically. Cleanly. But what Mara didn't know, what Elliot had failed to check, was that Vanessa had left something behind. Not a fingerprint. Not a file, a clause. Hidden in plain sight. And it wasn't just any clause. It was a line that would change everything. It happened on a Tuesday. Vanessa had gone back to her desk, well, not her real desk. That had been emptied days ago. Her nameplate was gone. The frosted glass door that once carried her title now stood blank, as if she'd never existed. What she had now was a borrowed corner on the fourth floor, tucked between a file cabinet that wouldn't close and a flickering light panel that hummed just enough to keep her from focusing. She wasn't supposed to see the slides, but the universe, in its cruel sense of humor, made sure she did. A junior associate from the marketing team, one who still smiled politely at Vanessa in the hallway, came rushing past with a stack of printed folders for leadership prep. She tripped slightly. One slid from her arms. Vanessa, without thinking, bent to help. And there it was, on glossy paper. Her work. Her deck. Her face. At least what used to be her face. The original photo was still there, faintly visible beneath the gloss, like a ghost image on a worn-out scanner. Vanessa remembered the moment it was taken. It was after the signing in Seoul, champagne glasses in hand, jet lag in her bones, and a rare, quiet smile she didn't know had been captured. It wasn't posed. It wasn't filtered. It was real. But now, someone had drawn a thick red X through her face, sharp, angry, final. In its place was a reprinted slide, same content, same formatting but with Mara's name, title, and a new photo in the corner. Hair curled. Smile rehearsed. Like a LinkedIn ad come to life. Vanessa didn't say anything. She didn't ask the associate why her face had been crossed out like a mistake on a whiteboard. She just stood there, holding both versions of the slideo, with a quiet moment of victory, the other with the proof she'd been erased. She took them back to her cubicle, closed the door that didn't really exist, and sat. She opened the drawer beneath her desk, pulled out the archive she had built herself, contracts, timelines, annotated drafts, margin notes written in hotel lobbies at 2 a.m., cultural guidance sheets for cross-border negotiations, side memos from internal risk advisors. She flipped through them slowly. All the color-coded tabs, yellow for finance, blue for legal, green for international teams, used to be marked VR. Her initials. Now, every tab had been overwritten. Make. Mara Cohen. It wasn't just the slide. It wasn't just the folder. Vanessa's name had been scraped out of the record. Her labor had been rebranded. Her fingerprints wiped. Her presence deleted. She closed the drawer gently and sat still. No tears, no rage, no desperate calls to HR. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes not from defeat but from something colder. Acceptance. But not surrender. Because in that moment, Vanessa realized something sharp and unshakable. They hadn't just stolen her credit. They'd made a fatal mistake. They'd assumed the deal was theirs. But it had never truly belonged to Stratasync. And certainly not to Mara. That deal had Vanessa's DNA stitched into its spine. And buried deep in one of those very folders was the one clause no one had read. Yet, the next morning, Vanessa showed up at exactly 8 a.m. No one expected her to. After all, she'd been erased silently, systemically, and thoroughly. The office was already whispering. Half-truths disguised as internal updates floated through Slack channels. Some said she had resigned. Others whispered she was under review. But no one dared ask her directly. And yet, there she was. Hair tied back. Blazer pressed. Eyes forward. The elevator dinged softly. She stepped out and walked across the marble lobby like she still belonged because deep down, she knew she did. She passed the reception desk, the open-plan workstations, the glass conference rooms where her presence used to carry weight. Not a single person made eye contact. Not because they hated her, no, it was worse than that. They were afraid of her silence. Vanessa didn't storm into anyone's office. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She didn't email HR. She didn't confront Elliot or Mara. She just walked to her makeshift cubicle on the fourth floor, 4 floors below the executive wing she once led and sat down. The chair wobbled slightly. The fluorescent light above her flickered, as if even the building wasn't sure what to do with her anymore. And still she stayed. There's a particular kind of strength in not reacting. In choosing silence not because you're weak, but because you're calculating. Vanessa didn't need a scene. She didn't need witnesses. What she needed was time. Across the hall, she caught a glimpse of Mara walking by. Polished. Confident. Wearing the same heels Vanessa had recommended 2 years ago during a late-night budget presentation. Their eyes met for half a second. Mara hesitated. A flicker uncertainty? Guilt? Fear? Vanessa couldn't tell. But she didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't flinch. She gave her nothing. And that silence hit harder than any words could. Later that day, Vanessa heard that Elliot had avoided the executive lounge altogether. His assistant said he was in back-to-back meetings, though no one saw him for hours. The leadership team passed by her cubicle like ghost shoulders, hunched, voices low, eyes darting. They didn't know how to handle someone who'd refused to vanish. Because that's what was expected, right? That she'd pack up, disappear, maybe post a vague goodbye message on LinkedIn and fade into polite irrelevance. That she'd leave the deal and the dignity behind. But Vanessa wasn't built like that. She didn't speak. She typed. Not resignation letters. Not legal threats. Blueprints. She began drafting emails not to lawyers, but to engineers she trusted, to partners she'd negotiated with across time zones, to former executives now scattered across the industry. She didn't ask for favors. She asked questions. Small ones. Precise ones. Would someone with deep post-merger compliance knowledge be of interest to your team next quarter? Still leading integration at Nordcom, or has that shifted? How's morale on your Singapore team lately? They weren't just questions. They were feelers. Not seeds planted, but soil tested. She didn't need to burn bridges. She was quietly building new ones. No one heard her footsteps. No one saw the map she was drawing. But she was still here. Still standing. Still calculating. Because Vanessa knew one thing better than anyone else in that building. Silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. And while they were busy erasing her, she was already writing her next chapter. The document looked ordinary. 12-point font. Black ink. Double-spaced. Tucked between pages of legal boilerplate and annexes full of compliance jargon that most people barely skim. But Vanessa knew better, because she had written it. Clause 93F. Simple. Precise. Hidden in plain sight. No one had asked her to add it. In fact, legal had left it blank. A placeholder. Something they planned to circle back to. But Vanessa didn't circle back. She inserted it herself. One cold night in Seoul, sitting at a cafe across from the Han River. Her laptop was dying. Her body was running on espresso and defiance. The Kinetra COO had just confided in her over dinner. We've been burned before. Our last merger fell apart because the lead executive vanished halfway through. Then, he'd leaned in, voice low but steady. If you're not personally overseeing this, we walk. And she believed him. So she made a promise. And then she put it in writing. Clause 93. F. In the event of any leadership reassignment concerning post-merger integration, particularly pertaining to Miss Vanessa Rhodes, the client reserves the right to nullify this agreement without penalty, pending written notice. She kept the wording plain, so plain, in fact, that no one saw it for what it was. A tripwire. Weeks passed. Pages were printed. Slides were polished. The leadership team reviewed the high-level summaries, but skipped the fine print. They were too busy planning photo ops, too sure of themselves. And now, as Vanessa sat alone in her cubicle 4 floors below the room where she once shaped billion-dollar Future phone rang. Unknown number. Washington, D.C. area code. She hesitated. Answered. Ms. Rhodes? A calm voice asked. This is Fiona Grant, contract attorney representing Kinetra. I've just reviewed the final binding agreement between your firms. Vanessa straightened in her chair. Yes, she said quietly. There was a pause. Did you author Clause 93F? I did. Another pause. Then I'd like to tell you it's airtight. Enforceable in any jurisdiction. Clear intent, unambiguous language. Your former employer doesn't seem to realize the leverage they just handed away. Vanessa exhaled, slowly, not out of relief, but out of confirmation. I suspected as much, she said. Fiona continued. They replaced you, quietly, without notification. But the clause speaks for itself. If you're not leading the post-merger, the contract dies. And they never saw it coming. Vanessa's eyes drifted to the folder on her desk. The one with the original contract. The one with her handwritten notes, initials, timestamps. Still there. Still intact. I don't plan to make noise, she said. You don't need to, Fiona replied. The document will do it for you. Vanessa ended the call and sat in silence. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not the kind born of humiliation, but of control. Power doesn't always look like shouting in a boardroom. Sometimes, it's a single sentence on a single page, buried under layers of arrogance and assumption. And now, that sentence was about to explode. They thought they'd won, but what they didn't understand was this. Vanessa didn't lose her position. She repositioned herself. And Clause 93F? That was the fuse. Already lit. It came at 4:37 p.m. The office was still humming the usual late afternoon rhythm of keyboards, coffee mugs, and half-finished Slack threads about dinner plans and end-of-day numbers. Vanessa sat at her cubicle, calmly reviewing an old calendar she didn't need to keep anymore. No one had spoken to her in hours. Then it hit. Not with a bang, but with a ping. A junior analyst barely 6 months in walked past her cubicle, white as a sheet. He didn't say a word, just paused mid-step, stared at her with eyes too wide for casual office banter, and kept walking. Vanessa looked up. 2 minutes later, the sound of rushed footsteps echoed from the executive wing. 3 people sprinted by the hallway, one of them holding a tablet, screen glowing with an email still open. Then another ping. And another. Within 10 minutes, Stratosynch's top floor turned into a pressure cooker. Emails. Phone calls. Hushed voices behind glass. The copy room door slammed. A woman from legal ran down the hallway, her heels clicking in a staccato rhythm of corporate panic. Vanessa didn't have to check her inbox. She already knew. But when she did, there it was. Subject. Per Clause 93F. Immediate response required. From Kinetra Legal Counsel. To Elliot Ward, Stratosynch Executive Leadership, Board Distribution List. Dear Stratosynch Technologies, per the binding agreement finalized on the 12th of August, please be advised that Clause 93F has been activated following the unapproved personnel reassignment concerning Miss Vanessa Rhodes. This contract is contingent upon Miss Rhodes' direct oversight of all post-merger integration. We do not recognize the substitutes. Until this matter is resolved to our satisfaction, all scheduled meetings, document exchanges, and transition activities are hereby suspended. No further communications will be entertained unless issued directly by Miss Rhodes. Respectfully, Hyo-in Park, Chief Legal Officer, Kinetra Corp. Short, cold, surgical. It was a corporate decapitation, clean and precise. The email CC'd everyone. Elliot, Mara, the legal team, the board, even the investor relations inbox. There was no wiggle room. No chance to spin it. No time to bury it in PR-friendly language. The merger Stratosynch's biggest deal in 5 years had just been frozen, not because of a lawsuit, not because of a scandal, but because they'd underestimated the very woman they thought they could replace. Vanessa sat still. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just reached for her cold coffee and took a slow sip. Across the hall, Mara passed by once. She didn't stop. Didn't say a word. Vanessa heard someone mention she'd been seen crying in the executive bathroom, though no one could confirm it. Robert, the CEO, didn't emerge from his office all evening. There was no all-hands meeting, no damage control memo, just whispered chaos and silent questions. How did this happen? Who missed it? What did Vanessa do? But Vanessa didn't need to answer, because the clause had already spoken. And the most dangerous part? She hadn't even moved. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't posted online. She hadn't threatened or sued or demanded anything. All she did was stay, while the empire that erased her began to quietly unravel an unread clause at a time. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the walls were vibrating. Not literally, but close enough. The executive floor, usually a quiet hum of controlled confidence, now pulsed with nervous footsteps, slammed doors, and sharp whispers that didn't bother waiting for privacy. Vanessa sat at her cubicle one floor below, pretending to type a report no one had assigned. She didn't need a meeting invite to know what was happening above her. Elliot had called an emergency session with the board. Not just because the merger had stalled. Because they were exposed. Clause 93F had gone viral internally, at least. It wasn't just a legal issue, it was a story. A symbol. The kind of thing that spreads fast in corporate circles. The woman they replaced in silence had written their downfall in ink. And now, they were scrambling to find someone to blame. First, Elliot turned on legal. Why didn't anyone flag this clause? Legal countered. It wasn't in the original draft. She added it herself. Why wasn't it removed? You signed it, someone replied flatly. Next, he shifted to PR. Spin this. Say it's a miscommunication, a minor delay. But even PR knew you don't spin a signed clause. Then came the predictable pivot blaming Vanessa herself. She buried it. Elliot snapped. She set us up. She wanted this. The room fell quiet. Until a voice cut through. Low. Even. Female. Catherine Lennox, senior board member, former antitrust lawyer, and the kind of woman who didn't waste time raising her voice because she'd mastered the art of making silence sound like judgment. She placed a copy of the agreement on the table. Page open, clause highlighted. I've read this contract twice, she said, her tone cool as steel. Let's stop pretending this was a clerical error. No one moved. I recall a closed-door meeting 3 weeks before the signing, she continued. You said, quote, Vanessa's visibility needs to be scaled back. She's making leadership look weak. Dead silence. Elliot swallowed. I didn't mean. You did, she interrupted. Then she turned to the room. We didn't lose this deal because of Clause 93. F. We lost it because we removed the one person who built it. Another board member added, softly. We erased our own foundation. Downstairs, Vanessa sipped her coffee. Still, no one had called her. No apology. No reinstatement. No outreach. But she didn't need it. Because now, she didn't have to prove anything. The proof was echoing through boardroom walls she no longer had to sit inside. A colleague she once mentored forwarded her a screenshot that afternoon in internal chat between executives. Robert's trying to shift the blame to legal. Catherine isn't buying it. Half the board's siding with her. They're furious he never read the final draft. Vanessa smiled, just barely. Not out of pettiness, but because for the first time, the silence she'd been forced to live in now belonged to them. Their voices were the ones growing hoarse. Their credibility was unraveling, and all she had done was stay seated. No confrontation, no press release, just presence, calculated, calm, undeniable. Because in the end, she hadn't needed to scream. She just needed them to hear what silence sounds like when it comes from the person they tried to forget. And now, they couldn't forget her if they tried. It was a Wednesday morning when the call came. Vanessa had just refilled her coffee, warm, bitter, a little too strong. She was back at her cubicle, same scuffed chair, same flickering overhead light. The world upstairs was still unraveling, and she had no intention of interrupting the chaos. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Manhattan area code. She stared at it for a second, thumb hovering, uncertain. Then answered. Vanessa Rhodes, she said. A pause. Then a voice calm, direct, male. Vanessa, it's Jonah Paddle. We spoke a few months back, if you remember. She did. Jonah was the COO of Avanex, one of Stratos Inc.'s fiercest competitors. He'd reached out to her once before, discreetly, with an offer to join their executive team. She had turned him down. At the time, she was still loyal, still hopeful, still holding the pieces of the merger together. Now, that loyalty had cost her a title, a salary, and 15 years of legacy. But not her value. Jonah didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I heard about what happened," he said. "And let me be clear, it shouldn't have." She didn't respond. He continued, voice steady. "We'd like to revisit our offer, with a few upgrades." Vanessa leaned back, eyes drifting to the corner of her desk where the contract folder still sat worn, dog-eared but undefeated. "I'm listening," she said. Jonah laid it out cleanly. Double the base salary. Executive stock options. Remote flexibility if she wanted it. A dedicated floor in their DC headquarters. "And one more thing," he added, his tone softening. "This wasn't just our idea. Someone encouraged us to reach back out." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Who?" A pause. Then, Hyojin Park. The name landed like a quiet revelation. Kinetra's legal chief. The same woman who had signed the email that brought Stratos Inc. to its knees. "She called you a non-negotiable asset," Jonah said. "Said the deal didn't fall apart because of paperwork. It fell apart because you weren't in it. And she doesn't want the next one unless you are." Vanessa stared at the far wall of her cubicle. The cheap laminate, the faded carpet, the silence. And suddenly, it all felt distant, small, like a life she had already outgrown but hadn't realized she was still living in. She didn't feel giddy or vindicated. She felt ready. But this time, she wasn't walking into someone else's hierarchy. She was drawing her own map. "There's a condition," she said. "Of course," Jonah replied. "What do you need?" "I choose my team," she said. "I approve every hire under my division, especially in post-deal integration." Another pause but shorter. "Done." She nodded, mostly to herself. "And one more thing," she added. She reached into the drawer, pulled out the folder from Munich. The one with the original letter handwritten, dated, personal. The one that reminded her who she was when no one else did. "This time," she said, voice calm, unwavering. "I don't just want to negotiate the deals. I want full life cycle authority from first pitch to final renewal." Jonah didn't hesitate. "You'll have it." She didn't say yes. Not yet. But she didn't say no. She hung up, placed the phone face down on the desk, and breathed. For the first time in months, she wasn't reacting. She was deciding. Because now, it wasn't about climbing back into a room they'd pushed her out of. It was about building a better one with doors no one could close behind her. The sun poured into the boardroom like quiet victory. It was a high-floor conference suite in Midtown Manhattan. Glass walls, custom walnut table, leather chairs so soft they didn't creak when you shifted. Everything about the space whispered importance, power, permanence, poise. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, a crisp leather folder in front of her, flanked by executives who knew better than to interrupt. Avanex's senior leadership waited in respectful silence. Jonah sat beside her, not above, not ahead, but beside. She looked down at the final agreement. The title line alone carried more weight than most full careers. Total contract value: 1,125 billion. Client: Kintra Corporation. Vendor: Avanex Holdings. Global Oversight Executive: Vanessa Rhodes. Her name wasn't just a footnote. It was embedded into the structure, into the strategy, into the very clause that had dismantled her former company from the inside out. Clause 93. F hadn't just protected a deal. It had protected her name, her legacy, her worth. Kinetra's legal team had been clear in their final draft. All stages of post-deal operations, logistics, compliance, and integration shall be managed exclusively by Vanessa Rhodes. Substitution is not permitted under any circumstances. No one else. Not this time. No more erasures. No more invisible labor. No more vanishing credits. Vanessa looked up, meeting Jonah's eyes. He gave her a simple nod. Ready when you are, he said quietly, sliding the pen toward her. She took it. The weight of the pen surprised her not because it was heavy, but because it wasn't. Because the burden that used to sit in her chest every time she signed something on someone else's behalf was gone. This wasn't a borrowed signature anymore. This was authority. Earned, reclaimed, and freely exercised. She signed. And when the pen lifted from the paper, it wasn't just ink on a page. It was restoration. Across the table, the PR director quietly excused himself. Within 20 minutes, the press release was live full color, front page on Avanex's homepage. Avanex secures landmark deal with Kinetra. Former StratoSync executive leads new era of strategic integration. Bloomberg picked it up in under an hour. Reuters followed. Vanessa didn't refresh LinkedIn. She didn't check her old company's feed. She didn't need to. But later, over a quiet cup of tea, she received a text from someone still inside StratoSync. Lena saw the article mid-meeting. Froze. Elliot read it half an hour later, alone in his office. Neither of them saw it coming. Vanessa didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just leaned back in her chair and exhaled. Not from exhaustion, from release. Because now, there were no explanations to give, no confrontations to stage, no seats at someone else's table to beg for. She had the table. And this time, she wasn't waiting for permission to sit. She was the reason the room existed. 3 weeks later, the cracks were no longer cracks. They were chasms. It started with a headline Vanessa didn't even search for, but it found her anyway, blinking quietly from the corner of a muted news screen in a lounge she passed through. StratoSync announces 200 job cuts following failed merger. CEO Elliot Ward steps down. Amid executive shakeup. No shock. No drama. Just a sentence that closed the chapter they never expected to end. Inside the building she used to call home, the unraveling had accelerated. The deal with Kinetra had collapsed completely. Attempts to renegotiate had failed. Rumors swirled that 3 of StratoSync's major investors had pulled their capital within days of the press release announcing Avanex's win. Confidence, once held like a crown on the executive floor, had been shattered quietly, clinically, publicly. And the board? They weren't interested in hearing excuses anymore. Elliot was the first to go. He was asked to transition out in a private meeting, no public memo, no farewell post, just an internal notice buried at the bottom of a Friday newsletter. Lena lasted another week. According to someone who still worked in the building, she had been reassigned to a special project with no defined scope, no team, and no budget. One day, she walked into the office and found that her badge access to the executive lounge had been revoked. 2 days later, her calendar was empty. One of the assistants said she stopped wearing heels, stopped smiling in the hallway, stopped speaking in meetings. Vanessa didn't feel joy. Not exactly. But she felt clarity. She had learned that not all revenge is loud. Sometimes it's just the truth making its way back to the surface. One clause, one signature, one woman they thought could be replaced. And now, the empire that once tried to erase her was folding inward like paper soaked in rain. A week later, Vanessa stood in the new Avanex headquarters in D.C., a sleek, light-filled floor with no shadows to hide in. The marble beneath her feet reflected the new nameplate on her glass office. Vanessa Hodes, Chief Global Integration Officer. She passed a digital screen in the lobby. A muted clip from a business channel played in the background, the headline looping beneath it. StratoSync loses market share to rival Avanex. Leadership vacuum blamed for collapse. Vanessa didn't stop walking. She didn't need to. Because this was never about taking revenge. It was about taking her place. And as she stepped into the boardroom to lead her next deal, her phone buzzed once. A message. Unknown number. Vanessa. Can we talk? I think I made a mistake. Lena. She looked at it for a moment. No reply. No explanation. She didn't need to say anything. Because there are moments in life when the silence is the answer. When the fallout isn't about what you say, but about who's still standing when the dust settles. And this time, it wasn't them.